Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this WiCyS webinar. We're so grateful to have Aleria here with us, and they're going to be discussing more our research that we're doing on the state of women in cybersecurity and inclusion assessment. So my name is Lynn Dome. I'm Women in Cybersecurity Executive Director. We often go by our acronym WiCyS. We spell it WiCyS and pronounce it WiCyS like we sisters, because that's exactly what we are. We are a global cyber sisterhood. So our mission is to recruit, retain, and advance women in cybersecurity, and we do so by creating opportunities. We're a community comprised of women, men, allies, and advocates that have 6,800 members with representation in over 70 countries. We also have 56 professional affiliates all throughout Africa, Australia, Canada, France, India, Pakistan, Norway, Tel Aviv, the UK, and throughout the United States. WiCyS MITRE and WiCyS Lockheed Martin have corporate affiliates, and our specialty affiliates are artificial intelligence, BISO, critical infrastructure, cloud security, data privacy and cybersecurity law, neurodiversity, military, colors of inclusion, Latinas, and so many more. On top of all of that, we have over 220 student chapters, with Microsoft Philanthropies funding a global student chapter initiative. So that's just our community alone. What we do is create opportunities, and we have many different initiatives, like our skill development training programs that are funded by Google, Meta, Bloomberg, Craig Newmark's Philanthropies, Target, AWS, SANS Institute, ISC Squared, and so many more. We have scholarships, grants, and awards not only for our conferences, which the next conference is March 16th through the 18th, and other conferences as well. Our Cyber Talent Emergency Fund is for students to receive up to $599 within 48 hours of them submitting for that fund for true financial emergencies, like their car breaks down or they have medical expenses, because we don't want anything to deter them from their studies in cybersecurity. We have speaking and media opportunities for our members to be what others can see, and that's the cybersecurity professionals they are. In addition to all that, we have apprenticeships, internships, we participate in market research, we have leadership summits, leadership series, speakers bureaus, mentor-mentee program, and so many other initiatives. So if you haven't done so already, I encourage you to go to WiCyS.org and check out all things that we're involved in. And we owe all of that as a special thanks to all our strategic partners. You see the list here. We have many that are funding us with these year-round benefits. But our tier one partners are part of our mission support team, and that's AWS, Battelle, Bloomberg, Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute, Cisco, Peraton, Fortinet, Google, Intel, Lockheed Martin, Meta, Microsoft, Optum, Sandia National Labs, and SentinelOne. So today we're going to be talking about the state of inclusion assessment for women in cybersecurity. We are so fortunate to have Arshia and Paulo here from Aleria that's going to be diving in more deeper into the assessment. But I encourage you to ask questions throughout. At the bottom of your page, you have this chat feature for you to place your questions. And we're going to be getting to a Q&A session at the end of today's presentation, and we'll answer those live. But in addition to all of that, please stay tuned to all things of the WiCyS organization and subscribe to our newsletter. So, measuring the state of inclusion for women in cybersecurity, how did we get here? We know that women represent roughly 20 to 24% of the cybersecurity workforce, and progress has been made for women, because we forever had that kind of depressing statistic of women representing 11% of the workforce over our head for a very long time. So there has been a slight improvement there, although we know that there still needs more work to be done. So although we've made that progress, we also are still at a critical workforce shortage, with roughly 3 to 3.5 million unfilled jobs in cybersecurity. So our mission as a nonprofit is to recruit, retain, and advance women in cybersecurity. And we could recruit all we want, and we do so. We continue to recruit so many women in cybersecurity, and that is the pipeline. But what about that retention, please? Because that is in some instances, a leaky pipe. And what does that retention for women in cybersecurity look like? If our mission is to recruit, retain, and advance women in cybersecurity, it's more complicated to advance women in cybersecurity if that retention piece isn't the foundation and in place correctly. So all of that stems from this culture of inclusion. And that's why this assessment is so important to us and why WiCyS is so proud to partner with Aleria to put in the research, the time, and the attention on an assessment like this for our organization and for so many others. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic on over to the Aleria team, and they could take it from here.
Thank you so much, Lynn. We are so excited to be here again. I'm one of the co-founders of Aleria. My name is Arshia Malik. My pronouns are she, her. And in fact, I believe, yeah, there we are. We are 3 co-founders. So I'm here. I head up the client success and operations. I'm working very closely with the WiCyS team and you all to make sure this goes very well. And I'm joined by my co-founder and colleague, Paolo Gaudiano, who will be chatting in just a moment around our approach and measurement of inclusion. I wanted to quickly give you a high-level overview of what we do at Aleria, and really, we are coming in to look past representation. We want to understand what's happening in people's day-to-day life in the workplace. So we measure inclusion in particular, and we want to pinpoint where should organizations and business leaders focus so that they drive greater employee satisfaction, diversity, inclusion, and ultimately greater business performance. We know that inclusion and greater diversity leads to those things, but it's not super clear how to actually make that impact and focus on the right pieces to ensure that things are going in that direction. And so we're so excited to be working alongside this incredible organization with all of these wonderful initiatives that Lynn just talked about. You all do so much and you all have this amazing resource and community, and to partner with you all and work on setting up this benchmark for inclusion in cybersecurity is very exciting for WiCyS in particular, and of course for us to be part of that work with you and to leverage our approach and frameworks. And so with that, I will hand it over to Paulo, who's going to dive deeper into why we focus on inclusion, what that really means, and what you all can expect in the weeks and months to come. Thank you so much.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Arshia. Thank you, Lynn, and everybody else at WiCyS. I've had the pleasure of being at your last 2 annual conferences, and it's been really wonderful each time. And it's really quite an honor to be here. I think that it's great that we are working with you as an opportunity to create a benchmark, an industry-wide benchmark, and look forward to the project. And really what it boils down to, as Arshia already mentioned, is why inclusion. And Lynn, you made some references about the importance of a culture of inclusion. And we've always felt that it's extremely important to go beyond the idea of culture and feelings of inclusion and really get to the point of what exactly is it that makes people feel included or not, and how does that impact an organization. And the goal of this project is going to be, as you will see later, we'll mention, we're going to do a series of workshops, identical workshops that people can choose to attend, any one of them, to learn more about this and to actually help us by collecting some data anonymously. Again, we'll talk about more of that in a second, but I'm going to give you a very, very brief overview of the kinds of things that you're going to hear if you are able to join one of our workshops and where we're going to be actually measuring inclusion. And fundamentally, what it boils down to is that almost everybody that we work with wants to know essentially the same thing. They want to know, how does diversity and inclusion, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, influence the performance of the company? This is really the billion-dollar question that everybody wants to know about. And what's been frustrating about it is that, in general, even though there is a lot of evidence of correlations between greater diversity in an organization and their performance, the results have been somewhat elusive. And in fact, it was great to hear one of the bright shining lights that Lynn mentioned was that in terms of representation, certainly there have been some advances in the space of cybersecurity for women, but there are many other areas and many other kinds of underrepresented groups where unfortunately the evidence of improvement has been very elusive. We believe that one of the main reasons for that is what we call the DEI disconnect. And let me explain what we mean by that. People talk about diversity and inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We now hear people talk about belonging, justice, access, and a number of other words. But the reality is that if you look at the vast majority of studies and initiatives, they tend to focus almost entirely on diversity. And more specifically, they focus on representation. It's about counting people. It's about how many of this, how many of that, and defining buckets of people and then counting people. Why do we do that? Why do we focus primarily on diversity? We believe that one of the primary reasons is because diversity is relatively easy to define and measure. You ask people in which category or categories they belong, and then you calculate numbers and you look at percentages and you see how those percentages change over time. However, when it comes to inclusion, even a definition of inclusion is hard to come by. There are many ways of defining inclusion. One of the more popular ones that most of you may have heard about was offered initially by Vernee Myers at Netflix, who suggested that diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. Now, on the one hand, we like this definition because it gives a very intuitive sense of the difference between diversity and inclusion. However, unless you happen to be running a party company, it's not going to be a very helpful definition to help you figure out what exactly it is that you should be doing. And the reason why we think inclusion is critical is because ultimately, as Lynn already hinted at earlier when she said a few words, is the fact that it's not just about who you recruit, but it's who you bring on board and how you keep them on board. And what we would argue is that anything that happens within a company that causes any employee to feel excluded because of their personal traits is going to have a negative impact on the entire company. Why is that the case? Well, we talk about the idea of the culture of the company and how the company influences its people. But what is the company? The company is not the building, it's the collection of all the people that make it up, which means that whatever happens within an organization is going to influence the people within the organization. And in turn, it is the collective experiences and behaviors and attitudes of those people that will shape the performance and the well-being of the organization as a whole. So to the extent that something is happening that is causing people to feel excluded, that will have a negative impact on the entire organization. Now, this leads us to what we think is a way of defining inclusion that makes it more tangible and ultimately, as you will see, measurable, which is to say that inclusion is a way of measuring all of the workplace experiences that influence individual employees. We're going to go in the workshops that we do for this project into a lot more detail about what we mean exactly and give more practical examples. But I just want to give you a little of a taste of the fact that we believe and have evidence based on some of the scientific research that we've done that inclusion drives both the diversity of an organization as well as its performance. And so we think that we need to revisit that question. And instead of just asking how diversity influences performance of an organization, we need to realize that inclusion is really at the heart of an organization that is both more diverse and more highly performing. Now, you might say, well, this is great in words. How do you prove that? The way we came to this conclusion was actually through some scientific research that's grounded in this idea of using computer simulations to capture what happens within organizations as people interact with each other. And in fact, through some of our research, and again, we'll show more of this if you're able to join one of our workshops, we can show, for instance, that if there is a bias in the way that men are promoted relative to women, you're going to get a very, very interesting configuration that reflects very much what you see in the real world, where you get a predominance of men in the upper echelons of the company, and you get increasing numbers of women's lower and lower. And in fact, we've used this kind of simulation to quantitatively match data from a number of industries, showing that in fact, and I'm sorry, my slides are not advancing now, but let's see what's happening. Here we go. Showing that in fact, we can capture very accurately data from the McKinsey and Lean studies, showing the breakdown of gender by different roles in different industries. And with that simulation, we can capture that quite accurately. Now, this is interesting because it's not just about diversity, but I made the claim that inclusion impacts both diversity and performance. With these simulations, what we can do is to track what happens when somebody is passed over for promotion. Somebody who should have been promoted was actually passed over by somebody maybe junior to them. Well, when that happens, we can see the satisfaction of these people being influenced. And because of the fact that in that simulation that I just showed you, women are being passed over systematically over men, what you find, as shown by the yellow line, is that the collective level of satisfaction of women plummets, while the men are perfectly fine, they're getting promoted, they think everything is okay. What's going to happen in a real company when somebody's passed over and becomes frustrated? Their productivity will decline, which means that the productivity of the team on which they're working will decline. And more importantly, they're going to be more likely to leave the company. And it's a known fact that in virtually every industry, the representation being lower is always accompanied by a lower retention rate, of course. So what that tells you is that both the top line and the bottom line of a company have the potential of being impacted by a lack of inclusion. Now, we believe that it's more pervasive than that. It is true that it has to do with retention, but really we think that inclusion is something that should be seen as encompassing every facet of the organization, from recruitment and retention to productivity and the reputation, both internal and external. So given that this is such an important point, why have companies not been measuring inclusion more systematically? And one of the things that came out of our research, and again, we'll talk about this more in some of the workshops, is that inclusion itself is invisible. It's very much like privilege, or more to the point, it's a lot like health. When we were introduced tonight, we didn't say, "Hi, I'm Paolo and I'm very healthy." Similarly, we do not notice when we're being included, we notice when we're being excluded. So we don't go around telling people that we're being included, we say something happened that made me feel excluded. One of the most important conclusions from this work is that because we notice exclusion rather than inclusion, it means that those who enjoy the most inclusion are least likely to know it and understand it, which is why so many leaders who tend to be white and male of so many companies are almost completely unaware of the experiences that people who do not look like them are having in their own organizations. And using the same concept and thinking about how doctors understand health issues, we came up with this idea of looking for symptoms in organizations that are indicative of the inclusion health, if you will, of an organization. We have defined a series of categories of inclusion that represent the kinds of things that happen within organizations that make people feel excluded, whether it's about not being paid enough in compensation and benefits, or people being disrespectful, either toward you specifically or more generally within the organization. And this is how we create a framework in which we essentially ask people in a very confidential, anonymous manner using our online platform to share in specific experiences that have happened to them, tell us what categories they belong in, and then tell us what caused it to happen. Was this because of some policy within the organization? Was it because of your leadership? Was it because of your management? Was it because of your peers? Perhaps even the people that report to you. Maybe they're not being respectful to you. Maybe they're interfering with your ability to do your work. And of course, it can also be people outside the organization that are having that impact on you. Combining information about the categories and the sources provides us with incredibly detailed insights into the areas that companies should focus on, as well as the specific things that are happening and the groups that are being most impacted. And let me give you an example of the kind of results that we've been able to gather and the kinds of results that we will be gathering from the membership of WiCyS, as well as people from other sectors in cybersecurity and companies that are member firms or that are partner firms of WiCyS. Just to give you an example, the data that I'm going to show you is actually collected over a few dozen companies in technology sectors, mostly across the United States and Europe. And it shows, for example, the first thing that we can see is what are the most common categories that cause people to feel uncomfortable in the workplace that would be indicative of exclusion. And one of the things that we find is that almost universally, respect, or rather the lack of respect, is a significant problem. So here you can see, for example, numerical data based on responses from thousands of people sharing experiences and helping us to understand how these are categorized. And then the second thing that I mentioned earlier was about the sources. What causes people to feel excluded? Is it because of policies? Is it because of culture? Well, it turns out, and this may not be surprising, maybe not surprising to everybody, is that the vast majority of sources are typically people. They are leaders, they are managers, and their peers. And depending on the industry and on the organization, we see different values, but it's always about people, not about policies. In other words, it's how people behave with each other, whether it's about respect, whether it's about recognition, whether it's about growth and assignments. Any of those categories are often cited as being the result of people interactions within the organization. Now, at this point, I've only shown you data that looks at the aggregate across everybody in the organizations that we've tested, that we've measured. But one of the beauties of this work is that you can actually look at how people are experiencing their workplace on the basis of their demographic traits. One of the things that we've done with our existing data set is to compare the overall, what we call the exclusion score, which is a combination of how pervasive certain problems are, as well as how acute or severe they are. And when we compare the overall exclusion score for men versus women in our data set, we find that women have a substantially higher experience of exclusion than men. And in fact, we find that in overall data set, we see a 62% increase in the level of exclusion of women compared to men. We find that gender disparities exist in every single organization that we've ever sampled across many, many industries. We find that these disparities, the chart that I'm showing you is across all categories combined, but I will show you in a moment that these differences actually persist even when you drill down and look at individual categories. And we find that in some fields, including tech, the gender disparity can be well over 2x. So these are all concerning data, but the nice thing about it is that they're very, very tangible data. Let me show you what happens when we drill down by the categories. And I'm going to show you a chart in which we have two axes. And the idea is that anything that moves along the x-axis, as we go from left to right, are things that are more prevalent, meaning that a greater proportion of a given population has an experience that makes them feel uncomfortable in a particular category. On the y-axis or vertical, we have the severity, meaning that people complain about certain things more frequently. So ideally, you would like to see all of the categories being in the lower left corner, and you would like to see them staying away from the upper right corner. Upper right is not good because it's more prevalent and more severe. So first, we look at the top 5 categories for men. And you can see, once again, respect stands out as being problematic. It's more up and to the right than any other categories. But what happens when we overlay the categories for women is stunning. We see that in all of these top 5 categories, both the prevalence and the severity experienced by women is substantially higher than it is for men. And again, this is a fairly universal finding that we see in virtually every company that we've worked with. So already you can see how the data that we're going to be collecting for the benchmark is going to give us some very, very interesting insights about the kinds of experiences that are problematic and how these are particularly acute or how they may be impacting women differentially respect to men. But the last thing that I want to point out here is that in addition to the data, we can also get some beautiful insights by looking at the experiences that people share. I want to emphasize, using our platform, this is done completely anonymously. We have no way of tracking who these people are, but we also ask permission explicitly for every single experience that is shared, whether we can use it in providing insights in the reports that we create. And I'm going to share with you a few examples of the kinds of experiences that people share within categories to give you an idea of the level of granularity that we're able to gain, which we can then go back and use to provide insights and suggestions to decision makers. For example, one of the categories that we mentioned is compensation and benefits. And what would it mean to be unequal or unequitable or not inclusive in this context? Well, it's situations where the compensation structure may be unclear or not transparent, or where people feel that they're not paid adequately for their work, or where maybe there are inequalities in compensation that are evident to people, and so on and so forth. And let me give you an example of a couple of the kinds of comments that people have suggested, that have shared. For example, my male colleague makes more money than me even though we're in the same role. Or I'm not paid for additional tasks that I'm asked to take on. Or more general comments that indicate a lack of compensation clarity or transparency. I don't think anyone has any clear or visibility on what we're getting compensated on a monthly basis. What about other categories? We mentioned that respect really has a couple of facets, the idea of a general culture of respect versus people being directly disrespectful to one another. General culture refers to being in an environment where people think it's okay to make inappropriate jokes or thoughtless remarks, or to talk about very touchy, sensitive subjects with other colleagues and making everybody awkward. So things that are not necessarily directed at anyone in particular. Just to share the kinds of really poignant examples that we get, this is something, as you all know, in the United States, recently Martin Luther King Day was made a national holiday. Somebody complained how in a company-wide meeting, the vice president said that MLK Day was not a real holiday and that we shouldn't get the day off. Imagine being an African-American, a person of color, and hearing your VP saying that in public. That would be horrible. Other examples might have to do with gender. So for example, a coworker making demeaning comments about women in his life outside of work, especially in context to relationships. But not all examples have to be so dramatic. Something that we hear about all the time is situations in which groups of people engage in behaviors that feel exclusionary toward others, such as starting a meeting where the guys all start talking about last night's, NFL game or whatever the case might be. Then we can look at another kind of disrespect, which is disrespect towards individual. Unfortunately, we find that this is a very, very common problem. And in some industries, it is among peers. In some industries, it's managers, or I should say in some companies, it's managers being disrespectful to individuals. Occasionally, we also see peers, reports, and customers. Just to give you an example, again, of the incredibly painful comments that we see. Some of them are not so bad, but, for example, I being a foreigner, sometimes people, and I didn't write this one, but some of my colleagues make fun of my accent. I can tell you none of my colleagues have ever made fun of my accent, so I appreciate that, but it does happen in some companies. Or this is something that we saw recently. My manager told me I would be a happier person if I went to the gym twice a week. These kinds of comments, there is absolutely no room for them, and people should not be making these kinds of comments. Or here's another one that may be familiar to many of you in the cybersecurity space. I was once told the highly technical information I was asking for would not interest me. It would only interest my dad or my boyfriend. So those are just some of the examples of the kind of rich, insightful information that includes both numerical data as well as qualitative, detailed information and insights that we're going to be able to collect and gather during this process or during this project, and then share with you in the form of a benchmark report and then individual reports with the partner firms that participate in the project. And there are some very clear benefits that we have been able to identify over time by doing these projects. Among them is the fact that when you measure representation, you're essentially looking at a measurement that is a very lagging and indirect measure, meaning that it takes a long time for the diversity of an organization to change, and there are many factors that influence it. In contrast, the way that we measure inclusion gives you a very direct, real-time measure of what is happening in your organization right now. But I think some of the more intangible benefits is that representation and diversity explicitly make reference to differences between people. Whereas when we measure inclusion, we focus on shared experiences instead of focusing on differences, which means that instead of putting people into buckets, which we think is actually counterproductive, and there is increasing research that shows that labeling people actually leads to more negative sentiment, tokenization, and things of that sort. What we're doing with inclusion is to place experiences into buckets. And ultimately, we know what it feels like to be excluded, and nobody likes it. And nobody's going to disagree with, hey, let's make the organization more inclusive, let's make the organization more inclusive or less exclusive. The other benefit is that instead of having to say, oh my gosh, now I have to focus on creating better experiences for people of color or for LGBTQ plus or for people with disabilities. Instead, when you create a more inclusive environment, it benefits everyone, but it particularly benefits those who have been the most excluded. And lastly, whereas focusing strictly on representation and diversity tend to encourage a zero-sum game mindset. Oh, I didn't get a promotion because the promotion had to go to a woman or a person of color. When you're focusing on creating a more inclusive organization, you can show how to grow the pie for everyone. So in conclusion, I hope that you found this little teaser interesting. If you're able to join one of our inclusion measurement workshops, what we're going to do is we're going to do 4, and we may do more if necessary, but we're going to do 4 one-hour workshops scheduled at different times and different dates so that as many people as possible can participate. In those workshops, you will find more detailed information similar to what we shared with you at the beginning of the presentation. We'll show a bit more about the computer simulations. We'll talk in more detail about why diversity and inclusion is so important and why inclusion is so pivotal to the entire DEI spectrum. And then we will go through this anonymous online exercise where we will be collecting data. So we hope you will find this very interesting. We would love to have as many of you join as possible. There is a webpage on the WiCyS website that is linked down here, and I believe it's been shared also in the chat or in the announcement right now as we speak. And if you go to that page, you will find links to register to any one of these 4 workshops. They're identical. You only need to participate in one of them. We would love to have you. And I think at this point we're done, and we would love to answer any questions that you may have. And let's see.
Thanks, Paolo. I'm going to go ahead and end our slides. Very good. Wonderful. Great. So we have a lot of questions that are coming in. So lo and behold, lots of people have questions about this assessment as we expected. So I'll go ahead and start asking you those, and we could, get down to the answers of them. So have you ever considered a precise breakdown by subspecialty? This particular woman is a female pen tester and work with maybe 5% women, if that. Even technical cyber conference photos online, it is rare to see women, like example of some pretty popular conferences out there, but nowhere is she seeing the representation of roughly 20 to 24%. And that's really interesting because every panel that I'm on, CISO's panel presentation, when I am in a group of industry leaders, and we are talking about that percentage of women representing roughly 20 to 24%, we're all not seeing that representation in a lot of our circles as well. So you're not alone with not seeing that representation of roughly 20 to 24%, but that is the data point that we are referencing with that. So, Paolo, would you like to take the question if you've considered a more precise breakdown by subspecialty?
Well, that's really, I think it's more of a question for you. One of the things that distinguishes our work is precisely that we do not really focus on representation, meaning that we measure inclusion kind of universally. And yes, we do collect data that the participants can voluntarily share about some of their demographic traits and some of the role traits. What we found, honestly, and I think this will relate to a couple of the other questions that I've already seen scrolling up, is that there is really a fairly universal issue where if a company has a particular kind of exclusionary behavior, that tends to impact everyone, and it tends to impact more severely people as a function of what we describe as intersectionality, meaning that if you have more traits that differ from the, let's say, the canonical or the normative majority, then you're more likely there will be more ways that you will feel excluded. And so we have found that even when we had companies where there was a small enough group of people that we didn't really have statistically significant data, we still felt very comfortable that what we found to be general issues of inclusion would be particularly acute for the smaller groups. So a long answer to say we tend not to focus on very specific, and I know there was a question about age as well. Again, we find that a lot of that comes out naturally. We can measure that, but we find that ultimately it is rarely the case that a company is being exclusionary towards age, but not toward race or gender identity or sexual orientation.
Got it. Okay, so that your response right there, Paolo, actually answered a lot of the questions that were coming in. So thank you for that. So when we talk about inclusion in cyber, what has been the advancement for undocumented students? I don't think this is information that we have, or Paolo, if you're in your team have any information who are trying to enter the community, can it be possible for this community to advance in cybersecurity? That is something that we can certainly take offline. If you want to email info@WiCyS.org, and we could certainly look into these type of questions, very WiCyS specific, at a different time. So will we be distributing this presentation after today's event? Yes, everyone should receive a recorded copy of this presentation. And if you don't, please email info@WiCyS.org. Does this workplace interaction category include workplace violence towards women? I'll let the Aleria team.
I can jump in here. I will say that there's a couple different types of workplace violence that we see that can be kind of verbal abuse, emotional abuse, and more egregious forms. And we certainly do see that show up in workplace interactions and also respect towards you categories. I think it's something we can see typically in either of those. If you feel comfortable enough sharing something like that experience, we take that very seriously, and we certainly appreciate your trust in sharing that with us so we can understand that that's taking place. And we get those kinds of things when we work directly with one-off organizations as well, certainly. And I think the couple of the examples that Paulo gave earlier as well regarding respect towards you, I think there were a few that maybe aren't on the most egregious form of workplace violence, but there were some around verbal and emotional abuse, and we certainly see that they take many forms, and so that's something we encourage you to share with us if that's unfortunately your experience. And sorry, one last thing on that. When you attend these workshops, we will be providing you with very detailed and definitions and information for what all of these categories mean. You'll also have access to that as a reference, during and after the workshop, so that you know exactly where different things go, and we can answer more detailed questions as you kind of go through the process of sharing your experiences anonymously with us at those times. But thank you for thinking ahead on that, and we'll make sure you have that information.
Great. Yes, so everyone that has attended today's session or has registered to attend today's session, knowing that there's a conflict in their schedule, will be receiving a recorded copy of this webinar. It's also going to be available on YouTube, and we'll be sending it out in some various marketing emails to encourage folks to be signing up for those workshops. So in the announcements that's in the bottom of your screen, I included a link for everyone to go to and to be able to sign up for an inclusion workshop so that you could have an opportunity of participating in this assessment and really start trailblazing the way for other women in cybersecurity, so that we could dig in and dive in a little deeper on what does this look like for the state of women in cyber. So we appreciate everyone joining us today to learn more about what we're doing with the state of women in cybersecurity, the inclusion assessment, and to learn more about how Aleria Group is doing that and obtaining the information. And we would love for you to all sign up and participate even further.
There were a couple of more questions that came in. Do we have a few more minutes to answer them? Because I think a couple were...
Yes.
So I just wanted to address briefly, one of them was, are the workshops open only to WiCyS members? And Lynn, correct me if I'm wrong, but these are not open. You don't have to be a WiCyS member, correct?
Correct.
You should be in some role in cybersecurity, but you do not have to. In fact, that's part of the goal of this info webinar, is to invite other people who are in cybersecurity to participate. And I should also emphasize very clearly, you do not have to be a woman. In fact, it would be ideal if we had at least some men who participate, because that makes it possible to do a comparison. And so if, to the extent that there are men in the audience or those who identify as genders other than a woman who want to participate, please, by all means, we welcome everyone to participate. And there was also another question about, there were a couple of questions that are relevant, that are, I think, most relevant for me, which was about the taste of the full presentation. This was offered as a taste of the full presentation, what more is shared in the full session. And then they ask about the computer simulation. The full session, there is about maybe 35 minutes of introductory material. And you saw maybe less than 1/5 of what's going to be in there. So there is some conversations about, why is DEI important? Why should it be a central focus of a lot of organizations? But why is it that so little progress has been made? And we give some very interesting, we use a lot of analogies and a lot of what we call thought experiments, where we invite people to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in a somewhat different way than a lot of organizations think about. We spend a few minutes on the simulation, showing in a bit more detail how it works, why it's so relevant, and how it led us to think about inclusion in the way that we do. And then we also spend a bit more time, in fact, quite a bit more time, explaining in detail how the activity of collecting inclusion works. And then we usually leave about 20 minutes to do the actual collection, and then we do kind of a wrap up. So it's about an hour long, but it's quite a lot of content, and most people find the value of attending the workshop to be quite high, even if you end up not taking active part in the measurement part, or if you only have a small participation in that. And so you will hear more about the simulations. And then, of course, we're also happy to engage with people offline if they have any questions about simulations. We have papers we've written and online demos and things of that sort.
Beautiful.
I do want to emphasize that the data collection happens during these workshops. We give you more time after, but please do come so that you know how to use the platform, and you get to ask your questions and you get to participate. There is some education and training and really fun thought experiments, as Paulo mentioned. But then we do want to make sure we actually help you get on the platform and share your experiences and understand what that means and the data we collect. So that is part of the workshop as well. And I want to make sure that you all know that that is a key way to participate with us, and we'll make sure you have that information. Nothing to prepare, just show up, be ready to learn and engage and be part of this initiative with us.
And the last question that I see is, have you measured the breakdown of leadership versus mid and entry level in tech and cybersecurity? Well, so we will be measuring that. And in fact, one of the things that we ask at the beginning of the measurement process is, when we give people the opportunity to self-identify anonymously, we do have a couple of questions about role and kind of general level within the organization. And we have done it in the past, and it will not shock anyone in the audience to know that there are pretty dramatic differences in virtually every organization that we've seen, depending on the level. And the level of this, the level of inequality, if you will, or disparities between genders and other traits tends to be exacerbated as you get higher up in the organization. And we expect, we don't know, but I suspect that when we do this in the workshops and in this project, we will be very interested in seeing what will come out of that.
Wonderful. And then someone else asked about our emails. If you could just email info@WiCyS.org, WiCYS, I can make sure that the Paulo and the Aleria team all get those emails as well.
Excellent.
All right, well, that's a wrap. Thank you everyone for joining us here today. I really appreciate your time and attention. We'll be sharing out more information from the WiCyS organization on how to participate in these workshops and participate in this study. And if you have any additional questions, please email info@WiCyS.org. That's it. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.